I took the job at Meridian Storage because it paid $18 an hour to sit in a booth from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, and at the time that felt like the easiest money I'd ever be offered. 412 units across 6 rows, one entrance gate, one exit gate, a booth with a space heater that only worked if you kicked it twice, and a logbook I was supposed to fill out every hour on the walking patrol. That was the whole job. Watch the gate, walk the rows, write down that nothing happened. For the first 3 weeks, nothing did. I want to be honest about my state of mind before I tell you the rest, because I think it matters. I wasn't someone who scared easily. I'd worked nights before, in worse places than a storage facility off a state highway. I didn't believe in anything I couldn't explain, and even now, after everything, I'm not entirely sure I do. What I believe is that I saw what I saw, and heard what I heard, and I've stopped needing an explanation that makes it comfortable. It started small, the way these things always seem to. Week 4, a Tuesday, I was doing my 1 a.m. walk down Row D when I noticed Unit 214 had its roll-up door open about a foot. Not broken, not forced, just open, the way you'd leave it if you were planning to come right back. I checked the manifest. Unit 2114 belonged to a woman named Corinne Aldis, current on her payments, no red flags, no history of odd hours. I knocked, said the standard line, facility security, just checking on an open unit, and got nothing back. I pulled the door up the rest of the way. Empty. Not empty like nothing was in it. Empty like it had been swept recently, the concrete floor darker in a rectangle near the back wall where something heavy had clearly sat for a long time and had recently been moved. I wrote it up in the logbook as an unsecured unit, closed and locked it myself with the master, and made a note to have the office call the tenant in the morning. The office called her. She said she hadn't been to the facility in 6 weeks and had no idea why her lock would have been off. She drove out the next day, checked her unit, said everything was accounted for, and thanked us for catching it. I let it go. Locks fail. People forget. It happens. It happened again 9 days later. A different unit, Row F this time. A man's name on the manifest I didn't recognize. Unit 88. Same thing. Door cracked open, nobody inside. A section of floor cleaner than the rest, like something had been dragged out. This time I didn't call the office right away. I stood in that unit longer than I should have, and I noticed something I hadn't clocked in 214. A smell. Faint, almost sweet, underneath something colder, like a walk-in freezer that's been unplugged for a while, but hasn't fully caught up to room temperature yet. I told myself it was mildew. I wrote it up the same way I'd written up 214. The third time, I stopped telling myself things. It was a Thursday in my 6th week, and I'd started doing something I hadn't done before, walking the rows out of order at irregular intervals, because some part of me had started to suspect that whatever was happening only happened on a predictable schedule, and I wanted to catch it off guard instead of the other way around. 2:40 in the morning, Row B, a unit I'd checked 40 minutes earlier and logged as secure. Door open. Same width, same 1.5 foot gap, like whoever or whatever did this had a specific measurement in mind and never deviated from it. I didn't call out this time. I stood outside the gap and I listened, and for a long moment there was nothing, just highway noise from a quarter-mile off and the hum of the sodium lights over the rows. Then from inside, quiet enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, the sound of something being set down. Careful. Deliberate. Not dropped, placed. I had a flashlight and a radio and absolutely no weapon, because Meridian didn't arm its night guards, and I want to be honest that every rational instinct I had told me to back away and call it in from the booth. I did not do that. I've asked myself many times since why not, and the closest I've come to an answer is that some part of me needed to actually see, instead of just being afraid of not seeing. I pulled the door up. The unit was not empty this time. There was a shape in the back corner, low to the ground, roughly the size and stillness of someone crouched down and trying very hard not to be noticed. My flashlight beam found it before my mind had caught up to what I was looking at, and for one full second, maybe two, I genuinely believed I was looking at a person. A person folded into a shape no person folds into naturally. Joints bent at angles that made my stomach drop before my brain finished processing why. It moved. Not toward me. Away, fast, low, into the shadow at the back of the unit where my flashlight couldn't quite reach. And I heard that same careful, deliberate sound again, except quicker this time, less careful, more like something scrambling to finish a task it hadn't expected to be interrupted during. I did the thing you're supposed to do finally, which is that I stepped back, pulled the door most of the way down, and radioed the office even though I knew nobody would answer at 2:40 in the morning, because writing it into the system felt like the only thing keeping it real. Then I walked, not ran, though every part of me wanted to, back to the booth, and I sat there until my shift ended at 7, and I did not do another patrol that night. I quit 2 days later. I want to tell you that was because of what I'd seen, and it was, but it was also because of what I found when I finally worked up the nerve to pull Unit 214's file and cross-reference it against Unit 88's and against the one from Row B and against 7 others. I went back through the logs to check, going back almost 2 years before I'd even started working there. Every single one of those units had been rented, at some point, by someone who'd stopped paying and stopped answering calls within a few months of renting it. The facility's policy, standard for the industry, was to give a 90-day grace period, then auction the contents to recover the unpaid balance. What I found, going through years of these old auction records in a filing cabinet nobody had touched in longer than that, was that a disproportionate number of those abandoned units, I counted 11, though I suspect there are more I didn't find, had been rented by people who, according to public records I looked up out of a compulsion I still don't fully understand, had been reported missing around the same time their storage payments stopped. 11 people, 11 units, all within the same 6 rows I'd been walking alone every night for 6 weeks. Before I quit, I did one more thing I probably shouldn't have. Buried in that same filing cabinet was an old employee roster, going back further than the auction records, and I noticed something on it that I couldn't leave alone once I'd seen it. Meridian Storage had gone through 11 night guards in 9 years. 11. The same number as the units. I told myself that was a coincidence, the kind night shift jobs generate on their own. It's not unusual work for people to burn out on, and turnover in a job like that is normal. But one name on that list had a note next to it, handwritten, in different ink than the rest. Left mid-shift. No notice. Called facility twice after, wouldn't come back for final check. The name was Wallace Trent. There was an old timesheet stapled behind the roster with a phone number on it, the kind of thing that should have been shredded years ago and just never was. I called it before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the 4th ring, and when I told him where I was calling from, there was a long silence, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then he asked me, very quietly, if I'd started noticing the doors yet. I told him about 214, about 88, about Row B. He didn't seem surprised by any of it, which was somehow worse than if he had been. He told me he'd worked there for 8 months, and that it had started for him the same way, small and explainable, until one night he'd done what I did, pulled a door open instead of walking away, and he'd seen something he still couldn't describe without his voice changing, which I could hear happening in real time on the phone. He said he'd called the owner the next morning and told them he was done, and that when he tried to explain why, they'd told him almost gently that every guard eventually reaches a night like that, and that most of them just stop showing up rather than calling to explain it, and that he should consider himself decent for at least giving notice. I asked him if he'd ever figured out what it was. He said no, and then he said something that's sat with me since, colder than anything I saw in that unit on Row B. He said he didn't think what was the right question anymore. He said the units weren't storage for things people didn't want to carry around. They were storage for something else. And every so often, whatever collected the rent on that arrangement needed to move its holdings. And the widths of those doors, that exact 1.5 feet, had nothing to do with what fit through them, and everything to do with what didn't. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer that. He just told me to make sure I'd gotten my final paycheck before I stopped answering the office's calls. Because that was the one part of leaving that job he regretted rushing. And then he hung up, and when I tried the number again the next day, it had been disconnected. I don't know what I saw in that unit on row B. I've turned it over so many times that the memory itself feels worn smooth, the way a stone gets from being held too often, and I no longer fully trust my own recollection of the angles of it, the exact shape, whether what I saw crouched in that corner had actually looked back at me, or whether that's a detail my mind added afterward to make sense of how fast my body decided to leave. What I do know is this. The week after I quit, out of a need for closure, I probably shouldn't have indulged. I drove past Meridian Storage on my way to a job interview at 2 in the morning, on a route that took me nowhere near it and required a genuine detour to see. The gate was open, not propped, not broken, open the specific width I'd come to recognize, the exact measurement I'd seen on unit after unit after unit, as if whatever had been doing this had simply moved its attention from the units themselves to the one thing large enough to hold all of them at once. I didn't stop the car. I didn't call anyone. I drove home and I checked the local news obsessively for a week afterward, and there was nothing. No reported break-in, no missing tenant, no story at all, which somehow unsettled me more than a headline would have. Meridian Storage is still open. It has a new night guard now, someone I've never met, hired through the same staffing agency that placed me. I looked up the facility online a few months ago, half convinced I'd find it shut down, sold, demolished. It has 4.5 stars. The most recent review from 3 weeks ago is 1 sentence long. It says, "Whoever's on the night shift, thank you for being so thorough with the units. Noticed my door was open when I came by, and everything was exactly as I'd left it." I don't know who wrote that review. I don't know if it's from a real tenant describing a real ordinary act of diligence from a guard doing an ordinary job. I think about that measurement more than I'd like to admit. 1.5 feet, just wide enough for something to fit through comfortably, and no wider than it needs to be. I keep my own storage unit locked with 2 locks now, even though there's nothing valuable inside it. I check the gap under the door before I open it, every time, out of a habit I know is irrational and can't seem to unlearn. I tell myself it's just old anxiety from a job I should have quit sooner than I did. I try very hard to believe that's the part I should be worried about.